The moment Marcus walked into the boardroom, he could feel the atmosphere shift. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him, and he recognized the familiar cocktail of anticipation and predatory interest that always preceded a coordinated attack. His colleagues had gathered like vultures, ready to tear apart his latest proposal with the surgical precision of professional assassins. But something had changed in Marcus since his last humiliation 6 months ago. Where once stood a man who would crumble under the weight of public shame, now stood someone who had learned the most dangerous lesson of all: how to become unbreakable by first breaking himself. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began in the aftermath of what should have been his career's defining moment, the product launch that spectacularly failed, leaving him exposed and vulnerable before the entire executive team. They had circled him like sharks sensing blood, each critique carefully crafted to maximize psychological damage. The shame had been overwhelming, crushing his spirit and reducing him to a shadow of his former self. But, in that darkness, Marcus discovered something profound: shame only has power over those who haven't already conquered their own weaknesses. This is the essence of Machiavellian psychology applied to personal defense, the understanding that true invulnerability comes not from avoiding weakness, but from systematically destroying every vulnerable aspect of yourself before others can exploit it. It's a principle that transforms victims into victors, and the humiliated into the unhumiliable. The strategy begins with a fundamental recognition: every person carries within themselves a collection of insecurities, fears, and shame triggers that manipulative individuals will invariably discover and exploit. These psychological pressure points are like exposed nerves, sending waves of pain through your entire system when touched. Traditional approaches to dealing with shame-based attacks focus on defense, building walls, developing thick skin, or learning to ignore criticism. But Machiavellian psychology takes a radically different approach. It advocates for the complete elimination of these vulnerabilities through systematic self-destruction and reconstruction. When Marcus first encountered this concept, it seemed counterintuitive. How could destroying parts of yourself make you stronger? The answer lies in understanding the difference between destructive destruction and constructive destruction. Destructive destruction is what others do to you. They attack your weaknesses to diminish your power and elevate their own position. Constructive destruction is what you do to yourself. You methodically identify and eliminate your own psychological vulnerabilities before anyone else can weaponize them against you. The process begins with brutal self-assessment. Marcus spent weeks cataloging every insecurity, every fear, every moment of shame that had ever controlled his behavior. He examined his need for approval, his fear of failure, his anxiety about social judgment, and his desperate attachment to his professional reputation. Each weakness was like a button that others could push to control his emotions and behavior. But, once identified, these buttons could be systematically disconnected. The first weakness he chose to destroy was his need for professional validation. For years, Marcus had derived his self-worth from external recognition, promotions, praise from superiors, respect from colleagues. This dependency made him vulnerable to anyone who could threaten or withdraw that validation. The solution wasn't to become indifferent to success, but to completely restructure his relationship with it. He began by deliberately seeking out situations where he would be criticized or rejected. He submitted proposals he knew would be shot down, volunteered for projects where failure was likely, and put himself in positions where public embarrassment was almost guaranteed. Each time someone criticized his work, mocked his ideas, or questioned his competence, he practiced a specific response: complete emotional detachment combined with analytical curiosity about their motivations. The transformation was remarkable. Where once criticism would send him spiraling into self-doubt and defensive anger, he now observed attacks with the detached interest of a scientist studying specimens. He began to notice patterns in how people used shame as a weapon: the careful selection of public forums, the strategic timing of attacks, the specific language designed to maximize humiliation. Understanding these mechanics stripped them of their power. But destruction of weakness is only half the equation. The other half involves strategic reconstruction, building new aspects of yourself that are inherently immune to manipulation. Marcus began developing what he called anti-fragile confidence, a form of self-assurance that actually grows stronger under attack. Traditional confidence is brittle. It depends on success, validation, and the absence of criticism to maintain itself. Anti-fragile confidence is different. It feeds on opposition, grows through confrontation, and becomes more powerful when challenged.
This isn't arrogance or delusion, it's a systematic reframing of how you process adversity.
The key is to develop multiple sources of unshakable self-worth that exist independently of external validation. Marcus began cultivating competencies that couldn't be taken away: knowledge, skills, and capabilities that were entirely under his control. He studied psychology, philosophy, and strategy not just for professional advancement, but to build an internal fortress of understanding that no external force could breach. He also began practicing what he termed preemptive vulnerability exposure. Instead of waiting for others to discover and exploit his weaknesses, he began openly acknowledging them himself. When someone tried to shame him for a past failure, he would respond with detailed analysis of what he had learned from the experience. When colleagues attempted to mock his ideas, he would calmly explain the reasoning behind them while acknowledging their limitations. This strategy is particularly powerful because it removes the element of surprise that shame-based attacks depend on. When you've already thoroughly examined and accepted your own flaws, attempts to expose them become redundant. More importantly, your openness about weakness often makes you appear more confident and self-aware than those trying to attack you. The psychological principle at work here is similar to inoculation. By exposing yourself to small doses of the very thing that might harm you, you build immunity to larger doses. Marcus began seeking out increasingly challenging social situations where his ego might be bruised, his ideas challenged, or his reputation questioned. Each experience built his tolerance for discomfort and reduced the power that potential shame could hold over him. But, perhaps the most crucial aspect of this transformation involved developing what can only be called strategic empathy, the ability to understand and predict how others will try to manipulate you without being affected by those attempts. Marcus studied the psychology of manipulation, learning to recognize the early signs of shame-based attacks and the underlying insecurities that drive people to use such tactics. He discovered that those who rely on shaming others are invariably driven by their own unresolved fears and inadequacies. The colleague who publicly criticized his presentation was compensating for his own creative limitations. The superior who belittled his ideas was threatened by the possibility of being surpassed. The peer who spread gossip about his past failures was desperately trying to elevate her own status by diminishing others. Understanding these motivations didn't make Marcus compassionate toward his attackers. That would be a weakness. Instead, it gave him the strategic insight needed to neutralize their attempts at manipulation. When you understand exactly why someone is trying to shame you, you can predict their methods and prepare countermeasures. The countermeasures themselves are elegant in their simplicity. When faced with a shame-based attack, the reconstructed individual doesn't defend, doesn't justify, and doesn't apologize. Instead, they redirect the conversation toward the attacker's underlying motivations. A simple response like, "That's an interesting perspective, what makes you feel that way?" immediately shifts the dynamic. The attacker, expecting defensiveness or capitulation, suddenly finds themselves exposed and having to explain their own behavior. This redirection technique works because it forces the attacker to confront their own psychological state. Most people who use shame as a weapon aren't consciously aware of their motivations. They operate on instinct, driven by primitive impulses to establish dominance through humiliation. When forced to examine and articulate their reasoning, they often realize how shallow and self-serving their attacks actually are. Marcus perfected this technique through countless interactions. When a colleague tried to embarrass him by bringing up a past mistake in front of the entire team, Marcus responded with genuine curiosity, "I appreciate you bringing that up. That experience taught me a lot about risk assessment. What specifically about that situation resonates with your current thinking?" The colleague, expecting defensiveness, was completely unprepared for such a response and ended up looking petty and unprofessional. The beauty of this approach is that it requires no aggression, no counterattack, and no lowering yourself to the attacker's level. You simply refuse to play the game they've designed, forcing them to either engage honestly or reveal themselves as manipulative and small-minded. But the most profound transformation in Marcus came from understanding the deeper philosophical implications of his journey. He realized that the fear of shame is ultimately a fear of social exile, the primitive anxiety that if we're rejected by the group, we'll die alone and defenseless. This fear made sense in ancestral environments where tribal membership was literally a matter of life and death, but it's largely obsolete in modern society. Once you truly understand that social rejection isn't actually dangerous, that professional humiliation isn't actually threatening, and that other people's opinions aren't actually relevant to your survival or happiness, you become virtually immune to shame-based manipulation. This isn't sociopathy or narcissism. You can still form meaningful relationships and care about others. But you do so from a position of choice rather than desperate need. Marcus began to see shame attempts for what they really were: desperate bids for power by people who had never learned to generate genuine influence. They were using the only tool available to weak minds, the attempt to diminish others because they couldn't elevate themselves. Understanding this dynamic filled him with something approaching pity for his former tormentors. The final element of his transformation involved developing what he called emotional aikido, the ability to use an attacker's energy against them without generating any energy of his own. When someone tried to provoke him with insults or criticism, instead of pushing back, he would step aside and let their momentum carry them past him. Often, this meant simply agreeing with true criticisms while ignoring the emotional baggage attached to them. If someone said, "Your presentation was completely unprepared and unprofessional," Marcus would respond, "You're right that it could have been better prepared. What specific improvements would you suggest?" This response acknowledges the factual content while ignoring the shame attempt, leaving the attacker with no emotional target to hit. 6 months into his psychological reconstruction, Marcus faced his ultimate test. The quarterly review meeting had arrived, and, with it, his nemesis, Jennifer Walsh, the VP of operations who had made destroying his confidence her personal mission. She had been systematically undermining him for over a year, using shame and humiliation as her primary weapons. But, this time, something was different. This time, Marcus was ready. Jennifer entered the conference room with her usual arsenal: meticulously prepared criticisms, carefully documented failures, and a presentation designed to publicly eviscerate his performance. She had invited additional executives to witness what she clearly intended to be his professional execution. In the old days, Marcus would have entered this meeting with sweaty palms and a racing heart, desperately rehearsing defensive arguments that would inevitably sound weak and inadequate. But the Marcus who entered that room was fundamentally different. He had spent months systematically destroying every psychological vulnerability that Jennifer might exploit. More importantly, he had developed something far more powerful than thick skin. He had cultivated genuine indifference to her opinion and strategic insight into her psychological profile. As Jennifer began her attack, methodically outlining his supposed failures and inadequacies, Marcus employed the advanced techniques he had perfected through months of deliberate practice. Instead of defending against her criticisms, he listened with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying primitive behavior. He observed her body language, noted the strategic placement of her most damaging points, and analyzed the psychological needs driving her aggression. What he saw was revealing. Jennifer's attacks weren't driven by legitimate professional concerns, they were the desperate flailings of someone whose own insecurities demanded the regular humiliation of others. She needed to destroy Marcus not because he was incompetent, but because his potential competence threatened her carefully constructed image of superiority. This insight led Marcus to employ what he had termed psychological jujitsu, using an attacker's psychological momentum against them. When Jennifer finished her carefully prepared assault, instead of defending himself, Marcus did something that completely derailed her strategy. He agreed with her. "Jennifer raises some excellent points," Marcus began, his voice calm and analytical. The Hartwell project did fall short of initial projections, and there were definitely communication breakdowns in the third quarter. "I'm curious, Jennifer, given your extensive experience with project management challenges, what would you have done differently in my position?" The question was perfect in its simplicity. It acknowledged the factual basis of her criticisms while stripping away their emotional charge. More importantly, it forced Jennifer to shift from attack mode to problem-solving mode, revealing whether her criticisms were based on genuine insight or mere destructiveness. Jennifer's response was telling. Instead of offering constructive alternatives, she doubled down on criticism, revealing the shallow and vindictive nature of her motivations. As she continued attacking, other executives in the room began to notice the disparity between Marcus's professional composure and Jennifer's increasingly emotional aggression. This dynamic illustrates a crucial principle of advanced shame resistance. When you refuse to be emotionally reactive, you create space for others to reveal their true nature. Marcus's calm professionalism made Jennifer's vindictiveness obvious to everyone present. He didn't need to defend himself, her behavior defended him better than any argument could. But Marcus's transformation went deeper than tactical responses to individual attackers. He had developed what can only be described as systematic immunity to shame-based manipulation. This immunity operated on multiple levels, each reinforcing the others to create an impenetrable psychological defense system. The first level involved what he called assumption auditing, the systematic examination and rejection of social assumptions that make shame possible. Most people accept without question the idea that others' opinions of them matter, that social approval is necessary for happiness, and that professional success requires the goodwill of colleagues. Marcus had methodically dismantled each of these assumptions. He began by conducting a thought experiment, imagining that every person he worked with suddenly developed an intensely negative opinion of him. In the old days, this scenario would have filled him with terror. But, through careful analysis, he realized that such a situation would actually have minimal practical impact on his life. He would still possess his skills, knowledge, and capabilities. He would still be able to contribute value to organizations. He would still have access to opportunities to create meaningful work. This realization was liberating in the extreme. Once you truly understand that others' opinions of you are fundamentally irrelevant to your actual capabilities and potential, those opinions lose their power to control your behavior. You can still choose to value feedback when it's constructive, but you're no longer vulnerable to manipulation through the threat of disapproval. The second level involved developing what Marcus termed strategic transparency, the practice of preemptively revealing information about yourself that others might use against you. This strategy is counterintuitive because most people's instinct is to hide their vulnerabilities and project an image of perfection. But Marcus discovered that controlled self-disclosure is actually a powerful defensive technique. When you openly acknowledge your limitations, mistakes, and areas for improvement, you remove the ammunition that potential attackers need for shame-based assaults. If Marcus had already publicly discussed the lessons learned from the Hartwell project failure, Jennifer's attempts to use that failure against him would have appeared redundant and petty. More importantly, strategic transparency demonstrates a level of self-awareness and confidence that actually elevates your status rather than diminishing it. People respect individuals who can honestly assess their own performance and learn from their mistakes. This honesty becomes a source of strength rather than vulnerability. Marcus began incorporating strategic transparency into all his professional communications. When presenting new proposals, he would proactively address potential weaknesses and explain his mitigation strategies. When discussing past projects, he would openly analyze what had worked and what hadn't, positioning himself as someone who learned from experience rather than someone who made excuses. The third level involved mastering what he called emotional arbitrage, the ability to remain calm and analytical while others became emotional and reactive. This technique is particularly powerful because emotions are contagious, and the person who maintains composure in a charged situation automatically gains psychological advantage. Marcus practiced emotional arbitrage by deliberately seeking out situations where others were likely to become agitated. He would calmly present ideas that he knew would provoke strong reactions, then observe his own psychological state while others became emotional. Over time, he developed the ability to remain centered and analytical even when surrounded by anger, frustration, or hostility. This skill proved invaluable in professional settings. When colleagues became defensive or aggressive, Marcus would respond with curious questions and thoughtful analysis. His composure made their reactivity appear unprofessional and childish by comparison. Without saying anything directly critical about their behavior, he managed to highlight the difference between mature and immature responses to conflict. The fourth level involved developing strategic empathy, the ability to understand others' psychological motivations without being manipulated by them. This required Marcus to study human psychology not from a therapeutic perspective, but from a strategic one. He needed to understand how fear, insecurity, and ego drove people's behavior so he could predict and neutralize their attempts at manipulation. Marcus discovered that most shame-based attacks follow predictable patterns. Insecure individuals tend to attack others when they feel threatened or inadequate. Understanding this pattern allowed him to recognize shame attempts not as legitimate criticisms but as symptoms of the attacker's psychological state. When Jennifer criticized his work, Marcus didn't hear legitimate feedback, he heard the anxiety of someone who felt threatened by his potential. When colleagues made sarcastic comments about his ideas, he didn't hear wit, he heard the defensive mechanisms of people who felt intellectually inadequate. This perspective transformed potentially hurtful comments into useful information about others' psychological vulnerabilities. The fifth and most advanced level involved what Marcus called constructive indifference, the ability to care about outcomes without caring about the opinions that create those outcomes. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. Marcus still wanted to excel professionally and create valuable work, but he no longer cared whether others recognized or appreciated his contributions. This indifference wasn't born from cynicism or bitterness, it emerged from a deep understanding of human psychology and the recognition that most people's opinions are driven by self-interest rather than objective assessment. When you understand that someone's criticism might have nothing to do with your actual performance and everything to do with their own insecurities or political agenda, you can evaluate feedback for its practical value while ignoring its emotional content. Constructive indifference allowed Marcus to extract useful information from even the most hostile feedback while remaining completely immune to its shaming intent. If a criticism contained actionable insights, he would implement them. If it was merely an attempt at psychological manipulation, he would acknowledge it politely and move on. The transformation was so complete that Marcus began to notice a strange phenomenon: the more immune he became to shame, the less people attempted to shame him. It was as if potential attackers could sense his psychological invulnerability and instinctively chose easier targets. This isn't surprising when you consider that shame-based manipulation is primarily a power game, it only works against those who can be dominated. Marcus's immunity to shame had an unexpected side effect: it made him more rather than less likable. When you're not constantly defending your ego or seeking validation, you become more present in conversations, more generous with praise for others, and more willing to acknowledge when someone else has a better idea. Paradoxically, not caring about others' opinions made it easier for him to form genuine connections with people. This dynamic illustrates a profound truth about human psychology: neediness repels while self-sufficiency attracts. When Marcus was desperate for approval and terrified of criticism, people could sense his weakness and either avoided him or exploited it. When he became genuinely indifferent to their judgments while remaining professionally competent and personally pleasant, people began seeking his opinion and respect. The transformation also affected how Marcus handled success and failure. Previously, professional victories had given him temporary highs that were inevitably followed by anxiety about maintaining his status. Professional setbacks had sent him into spirals of self-doubt and defensive behavior. But, with his new psychological framework, both success and failure became simply data points useful for learning and planning, but not sources of emotional turbulence. This emotional stability gave Marcus a significant strategic advantage. While colleagues were distracted by ego management and office politics, he could focus entirely on creating value and solving problems. His consistent emotional state made him a reliable collaborator and an effective leader, qualities that naturally led to increased responsibility and influence. But, perhaps the most significant aspect of Marcus's transformation was his relationship with truth. When you're no longer afraid of having your weaknesses exposed, you can be completely honest about your capabilities and limitations. This honesty allows for much more effective decision-making because you're working with accurate rather than wishful information about yourself. Marcus began making professional decisions based on realistic assessments of his skills rather than ego-driven fantasies about his abilities. If he wasn't qualified for a particular role, he would say so directly rather than trying to bluff his way through. If he made a mistake, he would acknowledge it immediately rather than trying to hide or justify it. This honesty earned him a reputation for integrity that became one of his most valuable professional assets. 1 year after beginning his psychological reconstruction, Marcus found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. He was completely immune to emotional manipulation, yet more professionally successful and personally fulfilled than ever before. The boardroom that had once been a chamber of torture had become simply another workplace where he could contribute value and solve problems. The colleagues who had once terrified him with their capacity for cruelty had revealed themselves to be predictable and manageable. But the most profound change wasn't in how others treated him, it was in how he experienced himself. Marcus had discovered something that most people never realize: true power comes not from controlling others, but from being unconquerable yourself. When no external force can diminish your self-worth or alter your emotional state, you become effectively invulnerable to the psychological weapons that dominate most human interactions. This invulnerability manifested in ways both subtle and dramatic. In meetings where colleagues engaged in subtle power games and ego battles, Marcus participated with the detached effectiveness of a surgeon, focused on outcomes rather than personalities, interested in solutions rather than status. His immunity to shame allowed him to propose ideas without fear of rejection, challenge bad decisions without worry about retaliation, and support good ideas regardless of their source. The result was a form of professional freedom that few people experience. Marcus could advocate for unpopular but correct positions without anxiety about social consequences. He could take calculated risks without being paralyzed by fear of failure. He could collaborate genuinely with both allies and rivals because his self-worth wasn't dependent on winning interpersonal competitions. This freedom attracted attention from senior leadership, who recognized that Marcus possessed something rare and valuable: the ability to make decisions based purely on merit rather than political considerations. In organizations where most people's judgment is clouded by ego and fear, an individual who can think and act objectively becomes extraordinarily valuable. But Marcus's transformation wasn't just about professional advancement, it was about fundamental changes in how he related to reality. He had discovered that shame is ultimately a form of self-deception, a way of accepting other people's distorted perceptions of you as if they were objective truth. When you stop participating in this collective delusion, you gain access to a clearer and more accurate understanding of yourself and your capabilities. The techniques Marcus had developed were now second nature, integrated into his personality so completely that he no longer had to consciously employ them. When faced with criticism, he automatically separated factual content from emotional manipulation. When confronted with hostility, he naturally responded with curiosity about the attacker's motivations. When encountering praise, he evaluated it for accuracy rather than simply absorbing it as validation. This systematic approach to processing social information gave Marcus what can only be described as psychological superpowers. He could see through manipulation attempts that would fool most people. He could maintain emotional stability in situations that would devastate others. He could make accurate assessments of people's character and motivations based on how they attempted to influence him. These abilities didn't make him cynical or antisocial, quite the opposite. Because Marcus was no longer vulnerable to manipulation, he could afford to be generous, helpful, and collaborative. He could praise others without fear that it would diminish him. He could acknowledge his own mistakes without shame spirals. He could support colleagues' success without envy or resentment. The transformation had also affected his personal relationships. Friends and family members noticed that Marcus seemed more confident, more present, and more genuinely interested in their lives. This wasn't because he had become more socially skilled, but because he was no longer distracted by constant ego management. When you're not worried about how you appear to others, you can actually listen to what they're saying. Marcus began teaching his techniques to others, starting with a few close colleagues who had noticed his transformation and asked for guidance. He discovered that the principles he had developed could be adapted to different personalities and circumstances, but the core elements remained constant: systematic self-examination, deliberate vulnerability exposure, emotional detachment from others' opinions, and strategic analysis of social dynamics. One of his protégés, Sarah, had been struggling with an abusive supervisor who used public humiliation as a management tool. Marcus taught her the redirection technique he had perfected, responding to shame attempts by asking curious questions about the attacker's motivations. Within weeks, Sarah's supervisor had stopped targeting her, not because he had become kinder, but because his attempts at humiliation no longer worked. Another colleague, David, had been paralyzed by fear of making mistakes in front of the executive team. Marcus helped him develop strategic transparency, the practice of preemptively acknowledging limitations and potential problems. David began presenting his ideas with honest assessments of their risks and limitations, which actually increased rather than decreased the leadership's confidence in his judgment. These successes reinforced Marcus's understanding that shame resistance isn't just a defensive technique, it's a fundamental shift in how you relate to social reality. When you stop trying to manage others' perceptions of you and start focusing on accurate self-assessment and value creation, you become both more effective and more attractive to others. But perhaps the most important lesson Marcus learned was about the relationship between strength and vulnerability. Traditional thinking suggests that strength comes from hiding weaknesses and projecting invulnerability. Marcus discovered the opposite. True strength comes from being completely honest about your limitations while being utterly indifferent to whether others exploit that honesty. When you can acknowledge your weaknesses without shame, discuss your failures without defensiveness, and admit your ignorance without embarrassment, you become genuinely powerful. This isn't because weakness is strength, it's because honesty about weakness eliminates the primary weapon that manipulative people use to control others. Marcus's immunity to shame had become so complete that he could now observe shame attempts with scientific curiosity. When someone tried to embarrass him, he would mentally catalog their technique and analyze its effectiveness. When colleagues engaged in gossip designed to damage his reputation, he would study the social dynamics involved without feeling any emotional impact from the content. This analytical approach revealed fascinating patterns in human behavior. Marcus noticed that the most aggressive shame users were invariably the most insecure individuals. The colleagues who never engaged in public humiliation were typically the most confident and successful. The leaders who inspired rather than intimidated were those who had resolved their own shame issues and therefore didn't need to create shame in others. These observations led Marcus to a profound realization: shame is a form of psychological contagion. People who carry unresolved shame inevitably try to infect others with the same poison. But, when you're immune to the infection, you can help others recover rather than perpetuating the cycle. Marcus began applying this insight in his leadership role. Instead of using fear or intimidation to motivate his team, he created an environment where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than sources of shame. Instead of competing with colleagues for status, he collaborated to create value for the organization. Instead of hoarding information to maintain advantage, he shared knowledge freely because his security didn't depend on keeping others ignorant. The results were remarkable. Marcus's team became one of the most innovative and productive in the organization, not because he had superior technical skills, but because he had created psychological safety that allowed others to take risks and learn from failures. His collaborative approach led to breakthrough solutions that would have been impossible in environments poisoned by shame and fear. But the ultimate test of Marcus's transformation came when he faced his greatest professional challenge yet. The company was undergoing a major restructuring, and several executive positions were being eliminated. The competition for the remaining roles was intense, and the political maneuvering reached levels of viciousness that shocked even veteran corporate players. In the old days, Marcus would have been consumed with anxiety about his survival prospects. He would have engaged in defensive behaviors, political alliances, and desperate attempts to undermine potential rivals. But the Marcus who faced this challenge was fundamentally different. Instead of playing political games, Marcus focused entirely on creating value during the transition period. While others were distracted by rumors and backstabbing, he was solving problems and helping the organization navigate its challenges. While colleagues were spreading gossip and forming factions, he was collaborating with anyone who could contribute to positive outcomes. The contrast was striking. Marcus's approach made him appear stable and reliable in a sea of chaos and desperation. Senior leadership noticed that he was the one person who seemed more interested in organizational success than personal advancement. This observation didn't go unrewarded. When the restructuring concluded, Marcus not only retained his position but was promoted to a role with significantly expanded responsibilities. More importantly, he had earned genuine respect from colleagues who had witnessed his grace under pressure. The political players who had schemed and manipulated their way through the crisis had revealed their true nature and damaged their long-term prospects. This experience crystallized Marcus's understanding of a fundamental truth: in the long run, character is more valuable than tactics. When you're immune to shame and focused on value creation rather than image management, you naturally develop the qualities that organizations and individuals actually value: reliability, honesty, competence, and emotional stability. The psychological reconstruction that had begun as a defensive measure against workplace bullying had evolved into something much more profound: a complete reimagining of what it means to be strong.
Marcus had discovered that true strength isn't the absence of vulnerability, it's the integration of vulnerability into a larger framework of self-acceptance and strategic thinking.
As Marcus reflected on his journey, he realized that the title phrase, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others," wasn't quite accurate. He hadn't destroyed his weak self, he had transformed it. The insecurities, fears, and vulnerabilities were still there, but they no longer controlled his behavior or limited his effectiveness. The weak self had become a source of strength through acceptance and integration. By acknowledging his limitations without shame, Marcus had removed the psychological ammunition that others needed to diminish him. By understanding his fears without being controlled by them, he had developed genuine courage. By accepting his imperfections without defensive rationalization, he had achieved a form of integrity that made him virtually invulnerable to manipulation. This transformation offers hope for anyone who has ever been damaged by shame-based attacks. The techniques Marcus developed aren't just for corporate environments, they apply to any situation where people use emotional manipulation to gain power over others. Whether you're dealing with an abusive family member, a manipulative romantic partner, or a toxic social group, the principles remain the same. The path begins with the courage to examine yourself honestly, continues with the discipline to expose yourself to controlled vulnerability, and culminates in the wisdom to distinguish between useful feedback and psychological manipulation. It's not an easy journey, but it leads to a form of freedom that most people never experience: the freedom to be yourself without fear, to pursue your goals without shame, and to relate to others from a position of strength rather than desperate need. Marcus's story demonstrates that it's possible to become unbreakable not through hardness, but through flexibility, not through invulnerability, but through the integration of vulnerability into a larger framework of strength. The man who destroys his weak self doesn't become emotionless or antisocial, he becomes genuinely powerful in the most important sense: he becomes free. In the end, the greatest victory over those who try to shame you isn't revenge or counterattack, it's the complete elimination of their power to affect your emotional state. When you achieve this level of psychological independence, you don't need to silence your critics because their words have no more impact than the chirping of birds. They become irrelevant not because you've defeated them, but because you've transcended the game they're trying to play. This is the ultimate expression of Machiavellian psychology applied to personal defense, the understanding that the highest form of power is the power that doesn't need to be exercised because it cannot be challenged. When you become truly unshakable, the world has no choice but to accommodate your strength.